The arrow left the bow so fast it hissed through the cold morning air, and then it simply vanished into the dark line of trees ahead. Garin dropped to one knee, his breath catching in his throat, waiting for the sound of a body falling. Nothing came. No cry, no rustle, no proof that his arrow had found anything at all. The forest stayed silent, and that silence was worse than any howl could have been. Beside him, young Colm gripped his spear so tightly his knuckles turned pale. "Did you hit him?" he whispered. Garin did not answer right away. He was staring at the space between two crooked pine trees, where for one heartbeat, just one, he had seen a shape. Gray fur, yellow eyes, a creature larger than any wolf should ever be. And then it was gone, as if the forest itself had folded around it and swallowed it whole. "We should go back," Garin said finally, rising slowly to his feet. "Now, before the light changes." Colm did not argue. 6 men had entered these woods over the past 2 winters, hoping to end the legend once and for all, hoping to bring back proof, a pelt, a skull, anything that would let the kingdom sleep easier at night. None of them had returned with what they promised. Some had not returned at all. The ones who came back spoke of a wolf that moved like smoke, that seemed to know exactly where a man would step before the man himself knew it. They called him many things around the fire at night: the gray ghost, the beast of the black pines. But most simply called him Cale, because a name, even a frightening one, felt safer than admitting they did not understand what they were dealing with. Garin and Colm backed away from the tree line together, neither willing to turn their spines fully toward the darkness behind them. It took nearly an hour before they felt safe enough to breathe normally again, and by the time they reached the low stone wall that marked the edge of the village of Ashwell, both men were soaked through with sweat despite the chill in the air. The village of Ashwell sat at the bottom of a gentle valley, its rooftops made of gray slate that caught the morning light in a way that made the whole place look like it had been carved from the hillside itself. Smoke curled from chimneys. Chickens wandered between houses. It was, in every visible way, an ordinary place. But every person who lived there carried the same quiet weight behind their eyes, the weight of living beside a forest that did not belong entirely to them anymore. Word of Garin's failed hunt spread through Ashwell before the midday meal. By the time the sun reached its highest point, half the village had gathered near the well to hear the story again, each retelling adding a little more danger, a little more size to the wolf, a little more menace to eyes that Garin himself admitted he had barely seen for more than a second. "He is bigger than a horse," one woman insisted to her neighbor. "I heard he took down 3 sheep in one night." "Not one," said another. "My cousin says he has left nothing behind but bones when he finds a traveler alone," a third voice added, though nobody could quite say which cousin, or when, or where. Fear has a strange way of growing on its own, feeding itself with rumor, the way a fire feeds itself with dry wood. Nobody in Ashwell had actually watched Cale harm a person. Not truly. But the stories had grown so large and so old that the truth of the matter no longer seemed to matter at all. He was the wolf that could not be caught, and in a world where very little could not be explained, that alone was enough to make him a monster. At the very edge of this gathering, unnoticed as she so often was, stood a girl of 13 years, named Elira. She could see the mouths of the villagers moving, could see their hands waving through the air, as they described claws and teeth and shadows, but she could not hear a single word of it. She had been born without hearing, and in a village like Ashwell, where few people had ever learned to speak with their hands the way she did, that meant she lived most of her days wrapped in a silence nobody else seemed to notice or understand. Elira watched the shapes their lips made, and pieced together enough to know they were talking about the wolf again. It seemed like they were always talking about the wolf. She had never seen him. She had only seen the fear he left behind in the faces of grown men, and something about that fear had always struck her as strange. She had grown so used to being looked at with confusion, with impatience, sometimes with a kind of gentle pity that felt almost worse than any unkindness, that she had learned to read a person's whole story simply from the way their eyes moved. And the eyes of the villagers when they spoke of Cale did not look at him the way they looked at a true monster. They looked at him the way people looked at something they did not understand, and that, Elira had come to believe, was often mistaken for the same thing. She turned away from the crowd and made her way home, past the bakery with its warm smell of bread that she could never quite describe the way others did. past the small chapel where the bell rang every evening at dusk without a sound reaching her at all, and finally to the modest cottage at the very last row of houses before the fields began, the one closest to the forest. Her mother, Nora, was outside hanging linen to dry when Alira arrived. She noticed her daughter's approach not by any sound, but by the small shift in the light as Alira's shadow crossed the yard, and she offered a warm, tired smile, the kind of smile that carried both love and worry in equal measure. Nora had spent 13 years learning to speak with her hands as much as her voice, learning the shapes and rhythms that let her daughter understand the world a little better, but even she sometimes ran short of patience on long days, and Alira had learned to notice that too. Alira's fingers moved quickly, forming the question she always asked when she came home from the village. Why are they all still so afraid? Nora's hands answered slower, more carefully, the way a mother chooses words, meant to soften a hard truth for a child. Because they cannot see what is really there, only what they imagine. It was a strange answer, one that stayed with Alira long after her mother had returned to her chores. She thought about it while she fed the chickens, while she carried water from the well, while she sat alone on the low wooden fence at the edge of their property, and watched the tree line in the distance, the same tree line that Garin and Colm had fled from that very morning. Alira had never been like the other children of Ashwell, and not simply because of her ears. She had always felt more at ease around animals than around people. A dog did not grow impatient when she failed to respond to words she could not hear. A horse did not whisper behind her back or exchange glances when she struggled to keep up with a fast conversation. Animals communicated the way she did, through movement, through posture, through the careful reading of small signals that most people never bothered to notice. In some strange way, she felt she understood animals far better than she understood most of the people in her own village, and they, in turn, seemed to sense something in her that put them at ease. The fields behind her family's cottage stretched out toward the forest in a wide, uneven patchwork of grass and low stone walls, and it was there, among a small flock of sheep, that Alira spent most of her afternoons. Her family kept a modest number of animals, not enough to make them wealthy, but enough to keep food on the table through the long winters. Among the flock was a lamb barely a season old, small and pale, and full of a restless energy that made him wander farther from the others than any of the older sheep ever dared. The village of Ashwell had built its life around a simple rule that every child learned before they could properly walk. Never go past the old stone markers that lined the edge of the forest. The markers had stood there longer than anyone could remember, worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain, and though nobody spoke openly about why they had been placed there in the first place, everyone understood that the forest beyond them was not entirely safe. Long before Kale had ever been given a name, there had been other stories, other warnings passed from parent to child like a kind of inherited caution. That evening, as the sky began to shift into deep orange and the shadows of the trees stretched long across the fields, Alira noticed the pale lamb standing apart from the rest of the flock. He was closer to the markers than she liked, his head lifted, ears twitching toward something she could not hear, and never would. She rose from the fence and began walking toward him at an easy pace, the same calm, unhurried pace she always used with anxious animals, a pace that said there is no danger here, only me. But the lamb did not wait for her. Something startled him, some sound or shift in the wind that only he could perceive, and he bolted, his small legs carrying him faster than Alira had ever seen him move, straight past the worn stone markers and into the shadow of the trees. Alira froze for only a moment. She knew the rule. She had heard it explained to her 100 times, through careful hand signs and worried faces. But the lamb was hers to watch, entrusted to her by her mother that very afternoon, and the thought of returning home to explain that she had simply let him vanish into the forest and done nothing filled her with a dread far sharper than any warning about wolves ever could. She told herself she would only go a few steps in, just far enough to see him, to call him back with the small whistle she used that carried more through vibration and rhythm than sound, a trick her father had taught her long ago, tapping his hand against her shoulder, in time with the notes, so she could feel the pattern, even if she could not hear it. The moment she stepped past the stone markers, the light around her changed completely. The warm orange of the evening sky vanished, swallowed by a canopy of leaves so thick that only thin threads of gold managed to reach the forest floor. The air grew cooler, heavier, filled with the smell of damp earth and old wood that Alira could not name, but could somehow feel pressing against her senses in place of sound. She walked forward carefully, her eyes scanning the undergrowth for any flash of pale wool. The trees here were older than any she had seen near the village, their trunks wide and twisted, their roots rising up from the ground like the knuckles of some enormous sleeping creature. She passed beneath low branches, over patches of soft moss, deeper into a silence that for once did not feel unfamiliar to her, because it was a silence everyone shared here, hearing or not. A flicker of white caught her eye near a fallen log, and relief flooded through her. There he was, the little lamb, nibbling nervously at a patch of grass, as if he had already forgotten his own fright only moments before. Alira quickened her pace, careful not to startle him again, her hand already reaching into the small pouch at her hip, for the handful of grain she always carried for exactly this kind of trouble. She was perhaps 10 steps away when she felt it. Not a sound, since sound had never been part of her world, but something else entirely. A change in the air. A pressure, subtle but unmistakable, the way a room feels different the moment another person enters it, even before you turn to look. Every instinct she had built over 13 years of reading the world without hearing it told her that she was no longer alone. Alira stopped walking. She did not turn immediately. She had learned long ago, from watching animals in the fields, that sudden movement often meant danger, while stillness often meant safety. Her heart began to beat harder against her ribs, a rhythm she could feel, even if she could not hear its pounding, and slowly, carefully, she allowed her eyes to drift past the lamb, past the fallen log, toward the deeper shadows of the trees beyond. At first she saw nothing but darkness layered upon darkness, the kind of deep, uneven shade that forests hold even in daylight. Then the darkness shifted, and within it, 2 pale points of light seemed to rise slowly out of nothing, steady and unblinking, fixed directly upon her. She did not run. She could not have explained why, not even to herself, but something about the stillness of those eyes did not carry the same violent hunger the villagers had described so vividly around the well that very morning. It felt, instead, like being watched by something that was as surprised to see her as she was to see it. The lamb, sensing the same presence at last, gave a startled cry and darted away through the undergrowth, back toward the safety of the open fields, leaving Alira entirely alone in the deepening shadow of the forest, face to face with the 2 pale eyes that had not moved, not even once, since she had first noticed them. The wind stirred the leaves above her, though she could not hear their whisper. The last threads of golden light faded from the canopy, as the sun dropped further behind the hills. And somewhere in the growing dark, a large shape shifted its weight, stepping slowly, deliberately, out from between the ancient trees, moving toward the one person in the entire kingdom who had never once run away from him. Alira's hands trembled at her sides, but her feet stayed planted where they were. She thought of every warning she had ever been given, every worried face, every frantic hand sign her mother had used to describe the dangers of the forest. None of it prepared her for what she actually saw as the shape drew closer, stepping fully into a thin shaft of fading light. He was enormous, larger than any dog she had ever seen, his fur a deep gray that seemed to shift color slightly, with every small movement of his body, sometimes silver, sometimes almost black. But it was not his size that struck her most. It was the way he moved, slow, careful, almost hesitant, as though he too was unsure of what would happen next. There was no snarl on his face, no bared teeth, no lowered head ready to charge. He simply stood there, several paces away, watching her, with an expression she had only ever seen before on the faces of animals that had been hurt and expected to be hurt again. Alira had spent her whole life learning to read what people's bodies said when their voices could tell her nothing. She read the wolf now the same way. And what she read, more than anything else, was caution. Not the caution of a predator sizing up easy prey, but the caution of something that had learned, over and over, that closeness led only to pain. Somewhere far behind her, past the stone markers, past the fields, the village of Ashwell was lighting its evening fires, its people settling into their homes with the comfortable belief that a monster prowled these woods, hungry and merciless. And here, in the fading light beneath the ancient trees, that same monster stood perfectly still, watching a girl who could not hear him breathe, waiting to see what she would do, as if her next choice mattered to him more than anything else in the world. Neither of them moved for a long time. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, the way it sometimes does in the last moments before full dark, and in that stillness, something passed between the girl and the wolf that neither of them yet had words to explain. It was not friendship, not trust, not even safety. It was something smaller and quieter than all of those things, the first thin thread of a recognition neither of them had expected to find in the other, out here, so far from everyone who thought they understood exactly what kind of story this was. It was Alira who moved first. She took one small step backward, testing the space between them, and the wolf did not lunge, did not growl, did not so much as shift his weight to follow. She took another step, and another, her eyes never leaving his, until the pale trunks of the outer trees appeared behind her, and the last of the daylight touched her shoulders again. Only when she felt the worn edge of a stone marker beneath her palm did she finally turn and walk, quickly now, back toward the fields, back toward the smell of wood smoke, and the sound she could not hear but somehow still felt, the low, steady hum of a village settling into evening. She did not run. Running, she had learned from every frightened animal she had ever calmed, was an invitation, but her legs carried her faster than usual, and her heart did not slow until the lights of her own cottage came into view, warm and small against the darkening hills. Nora was waiting in the doorway, her face tight with the particular worry only a mother of a child, who could not call out for help, would ever understand. Her hands moved fast and sharp the moment Alira came close enough to see them. "Where were you?" The lamb came back alone. "I thought." Alira did not let her mother finish the thought. She signed quickly that she had gone looking for the lamb and found him near the trees, that she had brought him back safely, which was true enough, though it left out everything that mattered most. She watched relief replace fear in her mother's eyes, and felt a small, uncomfortable twist in her chest, the particular guilt of a truth spoken carefully enough to hide a bigger one. That night, Alira lay awake long after the rest of the house had gone still. She stared up at the low wooden beams of her ceiling, and thought not about danger, though she knew she should have, but about the wolf's eyes, about the way he had stood so far back, so careful, so unwilling to close the last small distance between them, even though every story she had ever heard insisted he would tear apart anyone who came near. She thought about her mother's words from that afternoon, about people who could not see what was really there, only what they imagined, and she wondered, for the first time, whether the very same thing might be true of a wolf. She knew what the village would say, if she ever told them what she had seen. She knew what her mother's face would look like, what her father would do, how quickly the stone markers would be reinforced, and the warnings repeated twice as often. She thought of Garen's arrow vanishing into the trees that very morning, of the fear in his voice, as the villagers repeated his story again and again at the well, each time a little more monstrous than the last. None of it matched what she had felt standing in that clearing. None of it matched the stillness in those pale eyes, the careful, almost gentle way he had watched her, rather than approached her, as though he understood something about waiting that most people in Ashwell had long forgotten. Alira turned onto her side, watching the thin strip of moonlight that crossed her small room, and made a decision that she did not yet fully understand the weight of. She would not tell anyone what she had seen, not her mother, not her father, not the neighbors who gathered each morning to trade fear like a kind of currency. Whatever had happened in that clearing belonged only to her, at least for now, and some quiet, stubborn part of her already knew that this would not be the last time she crossed the stone markers into the shadow of the trees. Outside, far past the edge of the village, past the fields and the low stone wall, and the ancient markers worn smooth by centuries of wind, the forest settled into full darkness, and somewhere within it, a creature that every soul in the kingdom had been taught to fear lay down beneath the twisted roots of an old pine tree, his pale eyes fixed for a long while on the direction a small, silent girl had gone, before he finally, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, allowed himself to close them. Sleep did not come easily to Alira for the rest of that week, and each night, long after her parents had gone quiet in their room across the hall, she found herself replaying the same moment over and over, the two pale eyes rising out of the dark, the careful stillness of a creature everyone insisted was pure danger. By the third night, the pull toward the forest had grown into something she could no longer talk herself out of, a restlessness that sat in her chest like an unanswered question demanding to be finished. She waited for the right afternoon, one where her mother was busy at the loom, and her father was away helping repair a neighbor's roof, and then she slipped out through the back gate with a small cloth bundle tucked under her arm, filled with a few strips of dried meat she had saved from her own meals over the past 2 days. She told herself she was only bringing food because it felt wrong to have startled something and given nothing in return. She did not let herself think too closely about why that mattered so much. The walk to the stone markers felt shorter this time, though her pulse quickened the moment they came into view. She hesitated at the edge, her fingers tightening around the bundle, remembering every warning her mother had ever signed to her about the danger just beyond this line. But then she thought again of those eyes, of the way he had waited rather than attacked, and she stepped past the markers before she could talk herself out of it. The forest welcomed her with the same cool, heavy air as before, the same deep quiet that felt less like absence and more like a held breath. She moved carefully through the undergrowth, retracing the path she remembered from days before, past the fallen log, past the wide, twisted roots, until she reached the small clearing where she had first seen him. It was empty. Disappointment settled over her faster and heavier than she expected, and she stood there for a long moment, scanning the shadows for any hint of gray fur, any flicker of pale eyes. She told herself it was foolish to have hoped he would simply be waiting there for her, as if the entire forest revolved around a single meeting that had lasted only a few frightened minutes. She set the bundle of meat down carefully at the base of the fallen log anyway, arranging it the way she might leave food for a nervous barn cat, close enough to be found, far enough to not seem like a trap. She was turning to leave when the air around her shifted again, that same subtle pressure she had felt days before, the sense of being watched that had nothing to do with sound. She turned slowly, her heart climbing into her throat, and found him standing at the very edge of the clearing, half hidden by a curtain of low branches, watching her with the same unreadable stillness as before. This time she did not freeze. She lowered herself slowly to sit on the fallen log, careful and unhurried, the same posture she used with skittish lambs on their first days away from their mothers. She kept her hands visible and open at her sides, resisting the urge to reach for the bundle of meat again, letting the silence between them stretch out until it no longer felt sharp with fear, only full of a strange, careful patience. Minutes passed. She had no way to measure them beyond the slow shift of light through the canopy above, but eventually, the wolf took a single step forward, then another, moving with the same deliberate caution she had noticed before, as though every part of him expected pain the moment he came too close. He stopped several paces away from the bundle of meat, lowered his head, and ate slowly, his eyes flicking up toward her every few seconds, checking, watching, waiting for the moment she might change her mind about being safe to be near. Elira found herself smiling without quite meaning to. There was something achingly familiar in the way he watched her, in the careful distance he kept, even while accepting what she offered. She had seen that same look on the faces of children in the village, who mistook her silence for coldness, and kept their distance out of confusion rather than dislike. She had seen it in her own reflection more times than she could count. When he finished eating, he did not turn to leave. Instead, he lowered himself onto the ground several paces from her, resting his enormous head on his front paws, his eyes still fixed on her with a wariness that had softened just slightly since the first day. Elira stayed exactly where she was, unmoving, letting the quiet stretch between them the way it stretched between her and every creature she had ever slowly learned to trust. She returned 3 more times over the following 2 weeks, always in secret, always slipping away during the hours when her parents were occupied elsewhere. Each visit followed roughly the same pattern. She would leave a small offering, sit at a careful distance, and wait. Each time, the distance he kept from her grew a little smaller, his hesitation a little softer, until on her 5th visit, he settled down close enough that she could see the fine details of his fur, the pale scar that ran along one side of his muzzle, the slight stiffness in his back left leg that made him favor his other side whenever he walked. It was on that 5th visit, with the afternoon light slanting low and golden through the branches above them, that Elira finally allowed herself to reach out. She moved slowly, the way she always did, giving him every opportunity to pull away, to growl, to remind her of everything the village believed about him. He did none of those things. He simply watched her hand approach, his body tense but still, until her fingers finally made contact with the thick fur along the side of his face. He was warmer than she expected, his fur coarser near the surface but soft underneath. And beneath her palm, she could feel the faint, steady rhythm of his breathing, quick at first, then slowly, gradually, easing into something calmer. She let her hand rest there, tracing gently along his jaw, feeling the old scar beneath her fingertips, the slight roughness where fur had never quite grown back the same. She thought of her mother's words again, the ones about seeing only what people imagined rather than what was truly there. And she thought of every villager who had never once come close enough to see what she was seeing now. This close, there was no monster. There was only a tired, wary creature, who flinched slightly at kindness, because kindness was clearly not something he had been offered very often. Alira could not speak the words aloud in any way the wolf could hear, and even if she could have, he would not have understood them regardless. But she shaped them anyway, slowly, deliberately, the way she shaped words when she wanted someone to read them from her lips, even if they could not hear her voice. She mouthed the words carefully, her hand still resting against the warmth of his face, watching his pale eyes hold steady on hers. "You look lonely." It was not a grand or dramatic moment. There was no sudden transformation, no dramatic shift in the wind or the light. The wolf simply exhaled slowly, a long, low breath that seemed to release something he had been holding for a very long time, and leaned, just slightly, just barely, into the warmth of her palm. Alira sat with him until the light began to fade, until the shadows stretched long enough that she knew she needed to start the walk home before her absence became impossible to explain. When she finally rose to leave, he did not follow, but he did not retreat either, watching her from the clearing with an expression that felt, for the first time, less like caution, and more like something closer to comfort. Walking home that evening, Alira felt lighter than she had in longer than she could remember. For 13 years, she had lived in a village full of people who spoke a language she could see but never hear, who grew tired of slowing down enough to include her, who often treated her silence as a kind of absence rather than simply a different way of being present in the world. And here, deep in a forest everyone feared, she had found the first creature who did not need her to speak at all in order to understand her. She did not know yet what this friendship would cost her, or how quickly the quiet peace of these secret afternoons would be tested by the fear that still gripped every other person in Ashwell. She only knew, as she slipped back through the garden gate and into the warm light of her family's kitchen, that something important had shifted inside her, something she was not yet ready to explain to anyone, and was not entirely sure she ever would be. Over the days that followed, Alira grew more careful and more daring, in equal measure. She learned the quiet hours when her disappearance would draw the least attention, learned which paths through the fields kept her out of view from the windows of neighboring cottages, learned to time her return so that the fading light would explain away any flush in her cheeks or grass stains on her knees. She had never needed to be so deliberate about anything in her life, and there was something almost thrilling in the careful precision of it, a secret entirely her own, in a world that so rarely gave her anything private. The wolf, whom she had quietly begun to think of by the name the villagers used, though never with the fear they attached to it, began to expect her visits in his own way. On the days she arrived a little later than usual, she would find him already waiting near the fallen log, ears lifted, eyes tracking the path she always used, before she had even come fully into view. It startled her the first time she noticed it, this quiet proof that he, too, had begun to count on something that had not existed in either of their lives only weeks before. One afternoon, as she sat beside him running her fingers slowly through the thick fur along his shoulder, she noticed for the first time the full extent of an old injury along his back leg, a place where the fur grew thinner and the skin beneath puckered in a way that told a story she could not read but could certainly guess at. She traced her fingers over it gently, feeling him tense beneath her touch, and understood in that moment that his caution around people was not simply born of instinct. Something, or someone, had hurt him badly enough that the memory of it lived on in his body, long after any wound had closed. She thought of the hunting parties the village so often sent into the forest, of Garen's arrow vanishing into the trees just days before she had first seen those pale eyes watching her from the shadows. She wondered, with a small, uncomfortable twist in her stomach, whether that very arrow, or one very much like it, might explain the scar beneath her fingers now. She did not ask him, of course. He could not have answered even if he understood the question, but she found herself sitting a little closer to him after that, her hand resting a little longer against his side, as though her presence alone could somehow undo a small portion of whatever unkindness he had known before her. It was on one such afternoon, with the sun beginning its slow descent behind the western hills, that Alira very nearly gave herself away. She had lost track of time entirely, absorbed in the quiet, wordless comfort of simply sitting beside him, when a sound she could not hear but somehow sensed through the sudden stiffening of the wolf's body pulled her sharply back to attention. He rose to his feet in one smooth motion, ears pinned back, body angled toward the tree line closest to the village, every muscle drawn tight with alertness. Alira did not need to hear the voices to know that someone was moving through the forest nearby. She could see it in the sudden shift of birds bursting up from a stand of trees some distance away, could feel it in the tension radiating from the creature beside her. Her heart lurched painfully as she scrambled to her feet, torn between the instinct to run and the fear of what might happen if whoever was approaching caught sight of the wolf before she could get him to safety. She pressed her hand briefly against his side, a silent signal she hoped he would somehow understand, and gestured urgently toward the deeper shadows of the forest. For one agonizing moment, he did not move, his eyes fixed on hers, as though weighing whether to stay and place himself between her and whatever danger approached. Then, finally, he turned and slipped away into the trees with barely a sound, vanishing so completely that even Alira, who had spent weeks learning every detail of his presence, could hardly believe he had ever been there at all. She had only just settled herself back onto the fallen log, arranging her face into something she hoped looked unremarkable, when a figure emerged from between the trees. It was Petra, a woman from the village who gathered herbs and mushrooms along the safer edges of the forest, her basket half full, and her expression immediately sharpening with suspicion at the sight of Alira sitting alone so far past the stone markers. Petra's mouth moved quickly, and though Alira could not hear the words, she could read enough of the shape and urgency of them to understand the gist. "What are you doing out here alone? Does your mother know where you are? It is not safe." Alira forced what she hoped was a calm, unbothered expression and signed a simple explanation that she had been gathering quiet time away from the noise of the village, a truth twisted just enough to hide the larger one beneath it. Petra did not look entirely convinced, her eyes scanning the clearing with the wary alertness of someone who had grown up on stories of a beast lurking somewhere among these very trees, but she said nothing further, only gestured firmly for Alira to walk back with her toward the safety of the fields. As they walked, Alira glanced back once, toward the deeper shadows of the forest, searching for any sign of pale eyes watching from the darkness, and though she saw nothing, she felt certain, in a way she could not have explained to anyone, that he was there, watching, waiting to see that she made it safely home before he allowed himself to settle again into the quiet solitude he had known long before she ever crossed the stone markers into his world. That night, lying awake in the dark of her small room, Alira understood with sudden, uncomfortable clarity just how fragile this secret truly was. One curious neighbor, one unlucky moment of bad timing, and everything she had carefully built over these past weeks could collapse in an instant, taking with it not only her own safety, but quite possibly his as well. The village that feared him would not hesitate to act on any proof that he lingered so close to their fields, so close to their children, so close to a girl they already viewed as different enough to worry over. She turned onto her side, watching the same thin strip of moonlight she always watched, and made a quiet promise to herself that she would be more careful. She did not yet know how impossible that promise would prove to keep, or how quickly the quiet, secret world she had built in the shadow of the trees was about to be tested by forces far larger than one curious neighbor with a basket of mushrooms. Petra did not keep her suspicions to herself for long. By the following morning, whispers had already begun to travel through Ashwell, small at first, the kind of quiet comment shared between two women at the well, but growing steadily louder as the day wore on. A girl seen alone, deep past the stone markers, sitting calmly, as though nothing in those woods could possibly threaten her. It was the kind of detail that unsettled people, precisely because it made no sense within the story they had already decided was true. Alira felt the shift the moment she stepped into the village square that afternoon to collect the family's share of milled flour. Conversations paused as she passed, eyes lingered a beat too long before sliding away. A group of younger children who had once ignored her presence entirely now watched her with open curiosity, whispering behind cupped hands in a way she recognized instantly, even without hearing a single word of what they said. She had spent her whole life reading the world through expression and posture, and what she read now, radiating from nearly every face in the square, was suspicion, wrapped loosely around something that had not quite hardened into fear. Her mother noticed it too, though she did not yet understand its cause. That evening, as they sat together preparing the evening meal, Nora's hands moved with unusual hesitation, forming a question she seemed almost reluctant to ask. "Petra says she found you sitting alone past the old markers. Is this true?" Alira felt her chest tighten. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind more than once over the past weeks, always assuming she would find the right combination of truth and careful omission when the time came. But faced now with her mother's worried eyes, the words felt harder to shape than she expected. She signed slowly, choosing each gesture with care. "I like the quiet there. Nobody watches me strangely in the forest." It was, in its own way, the truest thing she had said about the matter in weeks, and she watched it land exactly as she hoped it would, softening the sharp edge of her mother's worry into something closer to sympathy. Nora's hands moved gently in response, tracing the shape of an old, familiar ache. "I know it is hard for you here sometimes, but the forest is not safe, not because of what people whisper, but because we do not know what truly lives within it. Promise me you will not go so far again." Alira made the promise with her hands, and hated herself only a little for how easily the lie formed, smooth and practiced, slipping into place beside the dozen smaller lies she had already told over the past weeks. She told herself it was not truly dishonest, only incomplete, a distinction that felt thinner and less convincing each time she leaned on it. 2 days passed before she allowed herself to return to the forest, and even then, she chose a different path than usual, circling wide around the fields to approach from a direction less likely to be noticed by anyone gathering herbs or watching sheep. The extra caution added nearly an hour to her walk, but by the time she reached the familiar clearing, the small ache of guilt that had followed her since her conversation with her mother eased into something quieter the moment she saw him waiting near the fallen log, already risen to his feet, ears lifted in unmistakable recognition. Their friendship, in the weeks that followed, deepened in ways that surprised her. She began to notice small habits in him that reminded her, uncomfortably and warmly all at once, of watching a person slowly learn to trust again after being hurt. He no longer flinched at the first movement of her hand toward his face. He had begun to nudge his head gently against her shoulder when she arrived, a gesture so unlike anything she had read about wolves in the frightened stories of Ashwell that she found herself smiling every time it happened. Once, on a particularly warm afternoon, he rested his head fully across her lap and stayed there for nearly an hour, unmoving, while she traced slow patterns along his ear and watched the light shift through the canopy above them. She began teaching him small things, more out of habit than any real expectation that a wolf could understand her, the way another deaf child raised alongside her might have. She used the same simple signs her mother had taught her years before, tapping her palm twice against her own chest before reaching toward him, a small ritual that meant, in her own private language, "I am here, and you are safe." Whether or not he understood the meaning behind the gesture, he came to recognize the rhythm of it, rising to meet her hand each time she offered it, as though the pattern itself had become its own kind of promise between them. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that Alira first noticed how differently the forest itself seemed to behave around him. Birds that startled and scattered at her own footsteps stayed calm in his presence. A young doe once wandered close enough to drink from a nearby stream, without so much as glancing toward the massive gray shape resting beneath the trees. She began to understand, slowly and without quite being able to put it into words, that the fear surrounding him existed almost entirely outside the forest itself. Within these trees, among the creatures who actually knew him, there was no monster at all, only a quiet, careful presence that the rest of the world had never bothered to truly see. One afternoon, as autumn began creeping into the edges of the forest, and the leaves overhead shifted slowly from deep green to gold, Alira arrived, to find him pacing near the edge of the clearing, more restless than she had ever seen him. She approached carefully, reading the tension in his shoulders, the way his ears kept swiveling toward a distant sound she could not hear. When she reached him, and pressed her palm against his side, she could feel his heart beating faster than usual beneath her hand. She followed his gaze toward the deeper part of the forest, and saw nothing at first, only shadow and stillness. But he would not settle, pacing a short distance away, and then circling back to her side, as though caught between the urge to investigate whatever had unsettled him, and an unwillingness to leave her alone. Eventually, with visible reluctance, he moved a few paces ahead of her, and looked back, a gesture so clear in its meaning, that even without a shared language, Elira understood immediately. He wanted her to follow. She hesitated only a moment before trusting him, trailing a short distance behind, as he led her carefully through a part of the forest she had never explored, weaving between ancient trees and over moss-covered stones, until they reached a narrow ravine she had not known existed. At the bottom of it, caught in a tangle of exposed roots, lay another young deer, its leg twisted awkwardly beneath it, clearly unable to free itself. Elira understood at once why he had been so restless. She made her way carefully down the slope, murmuring silently in her mind the same calming presence she offered every frightened animal, and worked patiently to free the trapped leg from the roots, ignoring the sharp scrapes along her own hands as she worked. The deer bolted the moment it was free, disappearing up the far side of the ravine in a blur of motion, and Elira sat back on her heels, breathing hard, only to find the wolf watching her from the ridge above, with an expression she could only describe, in her own private language of gesture and posture, as something close to pride. Climbing back up beside him, she pressed her scraped palm briefly against his muzzle, a small private acknowledgement that needed no translation. He had not simply wandered restlessly out of instinct. He had come looking for her, trusting her to understand something he could not otherwise communicate, trusting her enough to lead her somewhere new, entirely on the strength of whatever quiet understanding had grown between them over these past weeks. Walking home that evening, her hands stinging faintly from the scrapes, and her heart still full from the strange, wordless rescue they had carried out together, Elira found herself thinking again of her mother's words, about people who could only see what they imagined, rather than what was truly there. She wondered, with a small ache of sadness, what the village would think if they could have seen what she had just seen. A monster who came looking for help on behalf of a creature that was not even his own kind. It did not fit the story they had built around him, and she understood now, more clearly than ever, exactly why that mattered so much to keep hidden. The days grew shorter as autumn deepened, and with the shortening days came a shift Elira had not expected. Her father, Doran, a quiet man who spent most of his hours tending the family's small plot of land, began asking questions of his own, questions gentler than the whispers circulating through the village but no less pointed. He noticed the faint scratches on her hands that she explained away as chores among the brambles near the fence line. He noticed the mud on her boots that never quite matched the paths she claimed to have walked. He said nothing directly, but Elira caught him watching her more closely than usual over the evening meal, his eyes carrying the particular weight of a parent piecing together a puzzle they were not yet ready to name aloud. She knew she could not keep visiting so often without eventually being caught, and yet the pull toward the forest had become something she no longer fully controlled. It was not simply the wolf himself, though she had grown to care for him more deeply than she ever expected to care for any creature. It was the clearing itself, the particular quality of silence within it, a silence that did not feel like exclusion the way silence so often did in the village, but like belonging. Out there, past the stone markers, she was not the deaf girl who slowed down every conversation, who needed things repeated and gestured and simplified. She was simply herself, understood completely by a creature who had never once needed words to know her. One evening, dark clouds rolled in fast over the western hills, carrying the particular heaviness of an early autumn storm. Elira had lingered too long in the forest that afternoon, absorbed in teaching the wolf a new gesture, tapping 2 fingers against her open palm to mean stay, and by the time she noticed the darkening sky through the canopy above, the first distant flashes of lightning were already visible in the distance. She rose quickly, gathering her things, and began the walk back toward the stone markers at a faster pace than usual. The wolf rose with her, matching her stride, his ears flattening against the growing wind that Elira could feel but not hear. Halfway to the markers, the storm broke fully, rain falling in heavy sheets that soaked through her clothes within moments, and turned the narrow forest path slick beneath her feet. She had misjudged the distance in her hurry, or perhaps taken a wrong turn in her rush, and found herself suddenly uncertain which direction led back toward the fields. Panic rose quickly in her chest as she turned in a slow circle. the trees around her all beginning to look identical in the gathering dark and driving rain, every familiar landmark blurred beyond recognition. It was the wolf who solved what her own instincts could not. He pressed firmly against her side, guiding her with the weight of his body toward a direction she would not have chosen on her own, and though she could not hear his low, urging sound, she felt the vibration of it against her leg, and understood immediately that he wanted her to follow without hesitation. She trusted him completely, letting him lead her through the storm, one hand resting against his shoulder for balance as the ground grew slicker and the light grew dimmer with every passing minute. They reached the stone markers just as the worst of the storm settled fully overhead, thunder rolling through the ground in a way she could feel even without hearing it, lightning briefly illuminating the fields beyond the tree line in flashes of pale white. The wolf stopped there, as he always did, unwilling to cross fully into the open space beyond the trees, and Alira turned back toward him, soaked through and shivering, and pressed both hands briefly against the sides of his face, in a gesture of gratitude that needed no translation. She ran the rest of the way home through the storm, arriving soaked and breathless at the cottage door, where her mother's relief at seeing her safe quickly hardened into something sharper once the fear passed. Nora's hands moved fast and urgent in the lamplight, demanding to know where she had been, why she had been caught so far from home in such a storm, whether she understood how frightened they had been when she failed to return before the weather turned. Alira, exhausted and still trembling from the cold, found she no longer had the strength to maintain the careful web of half-truths she had built over the past weeks. She did not tell her mother everything, could not yet bring herself to speak the full truth of what waited for her beyond the stone markers, but she signed, more honestly than she had allowed herself in a long while, that something in the forest made her feel less alone than anything in the village ever had. Nora's hands stilled at that, her expression shifting from anger into something far more complicated, a mixture of hurt and understanding that Alira had not expected. Her mother pulled her into an embrace, instead of continuing the argument, holding her tightly, despite the wet clothes soaking through her own dress, and when she finally pulled back, her hands moved slower, gentler. "I did not know you felt so alone here. I am sorry we have not made it easier for you." It was not the confession Alira had been avoiding, not the full truth of gray fur and pale eyes and a friendship that would terrify every soul in Ashwell if they knew the whole of it, but it was, in its own way, a beginning. A small crack of honesty in a wall of careful omission that Alira had been building for weeks, one that left her lying awake again that night, wondering how much longer she could keep the rest of the truth locked safely behind it, and dreading, in a way she had not quite let herself feel before, the moment it would inevitably break open entirely. The rain had barely cleared from the rooftops of Ashwell when a new kind of unease began moving through the village, quieter than fear but no less persistent. Doran, still troubled by his daughter's soaked and trembling return the night before, made his own quiet inquiries the next morning, speaking with the men who gathered near the smithy at first light. He learned, to his growing discomfort, that Petra was not the only villager who had noticed Alira wandering near the forest's edge in recent weeks. A shepherd named Colwyn claimed to have seen her sitting motionless in a clearing well past the markers, seemingly unafraid, on more than one occasion. Another villager mentioned finding strange tracks, paw prints far larger than any ordinary wolf ought to leave, crossing paths that ran suspiciously close to where the girl was known to wander. None of it amounted to proof of anything specific, but taken together, the fragments began forming a shape that worried Doran more than he let show on his face. That evening, he sat across from his daughter at the table, his hands moving with careful deliberateness as he asked her directly, for the first time, whether she had seen the wolf that so many in the village feared. Alira felt the question land like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward faster than she could control. She could lie again, could reach for the same practiced half-truths that had carried her this far, but something in her father's steady, worried gaze made the words feel impossible to shape. Instead, she looked down at her hands for a long moment, before finally signing a careful, incomplete truth. "I have seen him. He has never hurt me." Doran's face went pale, then tight with a fear so immediate that Alira instantly regretted every version of honesty she had just offered. His hands moved fast and urgent, demanding details, demanding to know how many times, how close, whether the beast had ever shown aggression, whether she understood what kind of danger she had been walking into without a single word of caution reaching her ears in warning. Elira tried to explain, her hands moving as quickly as her father's, insisting that he was not what the village believed, that he was careful and gentle, and more afraid of people than people were of him. But she could see, even as she signed it, that the words were landing nowhere useful. Fear, once fully formed in a parent's heart, rarely made room for nuance. Doran rose from the table, his expression a mixture of anger and terror that Elira had never seen directed at her before, and told her, in signs sharp enough to feel almost like a shout, that she was never to go near that forest again. That night, for the first time since she had begun sneaking away, the family's back gate was fitted with a length of rope and a wooden latch too high for Elira to easily reach without help. It was not cruelty that drove her father to it. She understood that even through her frustration, but a fear so deep it had narrowed his thinking down to the simplest possible solution. Keep her close. Keep her safe. Keep her far from a danger he did not fully understand but trusted completely regardless. Word of what Doran had learned did not stay contained within their small cottage for long. Within 2 days, the story had shifted and grown as it passed from household to household, until the version reaching the far side of the village bore only a distant resemblance to the truth. By the time it reached the ears of a broad-shouldered hunter named Farlan, a man known throughout Ashwell for his stubborn confidence and his low tolerance for anything he could not explain, the story had become something far more alarming than a girl who had simply grown fond of feeding a wild animal. Farlan heard instead that the wolf had been stalking a child for weeks, drawing closer each time, testing the boundaries of an attack he had not yet worked up the courage to complete. Farlan wasted no time gathering support for a proper hunting expedition, larger and better prepared than anything Garin and Colm had attempted weeks before. He recruited 6 additional men, borrowed hunting dogs from a neighboring farmstead, and spent 2 full days sharpening spears and preparing traps, all while the story of the wolf stalking a helpless deaf girl spread further through the village, hardening into something the community now viewed less as rumor and more as urgent, undeniable truth. Elira, confined largely to the fields near her home under her mother's watchful eye, felt the shift in the village's mood, even without being told directly what was being planned. She noticed the extra men gathered near the smithy, noticed the dogs being fed and readied in ways that suggested more than an ordinary hunt, noticed the particular grimness in her father's face whenever he returned from the square. Her stomach twisted painfully with the growing certainty that something was coming, something far larger and more dangerous than a single failed arrow loosed into empty trees. She managed, on the 3rd day of her confinement, to catch a fragment of conversation between her mother and a visiting neighbor, enough scattered words and worried expressions pieced together to understand the shape of what was happening. A hunt was being organized, larger than any before it, meant to end the threat of the wolf once and for all, and it was being planned, at least in part, because of what her own father had revealed, out of fear for her safety. The guilt of that realization sat heavy in her chest for the rest of the day. She had never meant for her secret friendship to become the reason an entire hunting party marched into the forest with spears and dogs, and the fixed determination of men, convinced they were protecting a child from a monster. She understood their fear, even sympathized with it in some distant way, knowing exactly how frightening the unknown could feel to people who had never been given the chance to see past their own imagination. But she also knew, with a certainty that ached deep in her chest, that the creature they were preparing to hunt down was not the danger they believed him to be, and that if she did nothing, an unbearable mistake was about to be made in her name. That night, lying awake and staring up at the same low wooden beams she had studied so many nights before, Elira made a decision that frightened her more than anything she had faced yet. She could not simply wait behind a locked gate, while men she had known her whole life marched into the forest to hunt down the one creature who had ever fully understood her, without needing a single word. Whatever it cost her, whatever trouble it brought down upon her afterward, she would find a way past the gate, and she would reach him before Farlan's hunting party did. The first gray light of morning had barely touched the rooftops of Ashwell when Elira slipped from her bed, moving with a silence that had nothing to do with her missing hearing and everything to do with practiced care. She had spent half the night working the wooden latch her father had installed, prying at it with a flat stone until the old wood finally gave way just enough to let the rope slide free without waking anyone in the house. Her hands were raw by the time she finished, but the gate swung open beneath her palm, and the fields beyond lay open and gray in the early light. She ran faster than she had ever run before, her breath coming in sharp bursts that burned against the cold morning air, her bare feet slapping against dew-soaked grass as she crossed the distance between her home and the stone markers. She had no way of knowing exactly when Farland's hunting party intended to enter the forest, only the fragments of conversation she had gathered over the past 2 days, enough to understand that it would be soon, likely with the rising of the sun, when the hunters believed the wolf would still be settling from a night's hunting and easiest to track. She reached the markers just as the sky began shifting from gray to the faintest edge of gold, and without pausing to catch her breath, she plunged past them into the familiar shadow of the trees, following the path she now knew as well as any in the village itself. Every instinct told her to move faster, and yet every careful lesson she had learned from months spent calming frightened animals told her to move quietly, to avoid announcing her presence to anyone who might already be moving through these woods, with far less peaceful intentions than her own. She found him near the clearing, already awake, already tense, his ears swiveling toward sounds she could not hear but understood instinctively must be the distant approach of men and dogs somewhere in the forest beyond. He rose the moment he saw her, his body coiled with an alertness she had never seen in him before, and crossed the distance between them in a few swift strides. Alira dropped to her knees in front of him, her hands moving fast and desperate, shaping the sign for danger that she had taught him weeks before, tapping 2 fingers sharply against her open palm. She pointed back toward the direction of the village, then swept her hand in a wide arc meant to convey the presence of many, of movement, of threat closing in from multiple directions at once. She did not know how much of it he truly understood, but his body language told her he grasped the essential shape of her warning, even if the details remained unclear. She pressed both hands against the sides of his face, the same gesture that had always calmed him before, and tried to communicate the only plan she had managed to form during her frantic run through the fields. They needed to move deeper into the forest, away from the paths the hunters were most likely to follow, into terrain, where his knowledge of every twist and hidden hollow would give him an advantage no hunting party could easily overcome. He seemed to understand, or perhaps simply trusted her enough to follow regardless of full understanding, turning immediately and moving in the direction she indicated, with an urgency that matched her own. They moved together through the trees, Alira struggling to keep pace with his longer strides, her lungs burning, and her bare feet aching against roots and stones she could not always see in time to avoid. They had covered perhaps half the distance to the deeper hollow she remembered from their earlier explorations, when the forest around them shifted in a way even Alira, without the benefit of hearing, could not mistake. Birds burst upward from the canopy in a sudden panicked wave, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to carry a faint, rhythmic vibration that she recognized immediately as the sound of running feet and barking dogs, translated into the only language her body had ever been able to fully receive. The wolf froze beside her, his head snapping toward a ridge to their left, and Alira followed his gaze, just in time to see the first of the hunting dogs break through the tree line, followed immediately by the shouting figures of Farland and his men, spears raised, faces set with the grim determination of people who believed themselves to be racing toward a rescue, rather than toward a tragedy neither side yet understood they were about to create. Farland's voice carried across the clearing, though Alira could not hear the words, and she understood their meaning anyway, from the way his arms swept upward, pointing his men toward the 2 of them with unmistakable urgency. The dog surged forward first, barking wildly, and the wolf's body dropped low beside her, every muscle coiled, torn between the instinct to flee and an unwillingness to leave her standing alone in the open. Alira grabbed a fistful of his fur and pulled, forcing him to move with her rather than stand his ground, and together they broke into a run along the ridgeline, weaving between trees in a direction she hoped would lead them toward the narrow ravine where they had once freed the trapped deer. She knew the ground there was treacherous, full of loose stone and hidden roots, terrain that would slow the dogs and the men far more than it would slow a creature who had spent his entire life learning every inch of this forest by heart. Branches tore at her arms as she ran, her lungs burning, her bare feet screaming with pain against the rough ground, but she did not slow, could not slow, not with the sound of barking dogs growing louder behind them, and the memory of her father's frightened face driving her forward, with a determination she had not known she possessed. The wolf stayed close beside her the entire way, occasionally nudging her sharply with his shoulder to correct her path around obstacles she could not see quickly enough on her own. They reached the edge of the ravine just as the first dog crested the ridge behind them, and Alira felt a fresh wave of panic rise in her chest at the sight of the steep, uneven slope before her. There was no time to find a gentler path down. She half climbed, half slid down the incline, scraping her palms and knees against exposed roots, the wolf moving beside her with far more grace, occasionally pressing his body against hers to steady her when her footing threatened to give way entirely. At the bottom of the ravine, breathless and shaking, Alira turned back to see the hunting party gathered at the top of the slope, hesitating at the sight of the dangerous drop before them, the dogs barking furiously but unwilling, or unable, to follow down the same treacherous path. For one brief moment, it seemed as though they might simply be safe, that the natural barrier of the ravine would be enough to end the chase entirely. Then she saw Farlan begin working his way down the slope regardless, his spear held ready, his face set with a stubborn refusal to let the difficulty of the terrain stop him from finishing what he had come to do. Two other men followed his lead, moving more cautiously but no less determined, while the remaining hunters began working their way along the ridge, clearly searching for an easier path down further along the ravine's length. Alira understood, with a sinking clarity, that they were not simply going to give up. She turned to the wolf beside her, pressing both hands urgently against his face, trying desperately to think of some way to end this confrontation, without anyone, human or wolf, being hurt in the process. There was no path forward that involved simply outrunning them forever. Eventually, exhaustion or a lucky throw of a spear would end this chase in a way she could not bear to imagine. She made a decision then that terrified her more than anything else she had done that morning. Rather than continuing to flee, she stepped forward, placing herself directly between the wolf and the approaching hunters, her hands raised high enough that even from a distance, Farlan and his men would have no choice but to see her clearly before deciding what to do next. Farlan stopped short at the sight of her, his spear lowering slightly out of pure surprise, his face shifting rapidly from grim determination to open confusion. He shouted something toward her, his mouth moving fast, but Alira only shook her head, unable to hear a single word, and instead began signing as clearly and urgently as her shaking hands would allow, hoping desperately that at least one of the men approaching understood enough of the signs her mother had taught the village elders years before, back when the community had first tried, briefly and imperfectly, to make room for a child who could not hear. "He has never hurt me. Please. Look at him. Truly look." Whether or not Farlan understood the full meaning of her hands, he understood enough from her posture, from the desperate steadiness of a girl placing herself between armed men and a creature they had come to kill, that something about this situation did not match the story he had carried into the forest that morning. He held up a hand, signaling the two men behind him to halt, and stood there for a long moment, breathing hard from the climb, his eyes moving slowly from Alira to the wolf crouched low behind her. The wolf had not fled, despite every opportunity to do so, despite every instinct that should have sent him bolting deeper into the forest the moment the hunters appeared. Instead, he remained pressed close behind Alira, his body tense but controlled, his pale eyes fixed on the men before him, with a wariness that held no trace of the aggression they had all been warned to expect. He did not snarl. He did not bare his teeth. He simply watched, and waited, exactly as he had watched and waited on the very first day Alira had crossed the stone markers into his world. One of the men beside Farlan, a younger hunter named Bexley who had joined the party more out of a desire to prove himself than any deep conviction about the wolf's danger, lowered his spear slightly, his brow furrowing as he studied the scene before him. "He is not attacking," Bexley said, his voice carrying just far enough for Alira to catch the shape of the words on his lips. "Farlan, look. He could have already done something. He has not moved." Farlan's jaw remained tight, his grip on his spear still firm, but Alira watched something shift behind his eyes, a crack forming in the certainty that had carried him and his men through 2 days of preparation and a dangerous chase through difficult terrain. He took a slow step forward, and the wolf's body tensed further, a low sound rising in his throat that Alira felt rather than heard, vibrating faintly through the air between them. Alira moved quickly, placing herself even more firmly between them, one hand extended toward Farlan in the universal gesture for stop, the other reaching back to rest against the wolf's shoulder, a silent reminder that she was still there, still safe, still choosing to stand exactly where she stood. She held Farlan's gaze steadily, refusing to let the fear churning in her own stomach show on her face, and waited. The silence stretched long and taut across the ravine, broken only by the distant barking of dogs still gathered at the top of the slope, and the ragged breathing of men who had run hard through difficult terrain to reach this moment. Elira did not know what Farlan would decide. She did not know whether her small, desperate stand would be enough to undo weeks of fear and rumor built up around a creature that had, in truth, never given the village any real reason for the terror it had come to represent. She only knew that she would not move from this spot, not while there was still breath in her body, to stand between the two worlds that had somehow, against every expectation, both come to matter to her equally. It was the forest itself that finally broke the standoff, in a way none of them had anticipated. A sharp crack echoed from further down the ravine, followed by a low, guttural growl, entirely different from anything Elira had ever felt vibrate through the ground near the wolf beside her. Farlan's head snapped toward the sound, his face draining of color as a second shape emerged from the tangled undergrowth at the ravine's edge, larger even than the wolf, a wild boar of considerable size, tusks lowered, clearly agitated by the noise and commotion that had disturbed its territory. The boar charged before anyone could properly react, moving with a speed that closed the distance shockingly fast, aimed directly at Bexley, who had wandered slightly ahead of the others, and now stood frozen, his spear raised too late to do any real good. Elira felt the wolf move before she consciously registered the danger herself, a blur of gray fur launching past her, intercepting the boar's charge with a force that sent both animals tumbling sideways into the underbrush, in a chaos of snapping branches and furious sound. The fight was brief but violent, the wolf using every advantage of speed and familiarity with the terrain to drive the boar back and away from the stunned hunters, until the wounded animal finally retreated deeper into the forest, crashing off through the trees and leaving an unsteady silence in its wake. The wolf stood at the edge of the clearing afterward, sides heaving, a fresh scrape along his shoulder where a tusk had caught him during the struggle, but very clearly, undeniably, standing between the retreating danger and the men he had every reason in the world to fear and distrust. Bexley stared at the wolf for a long moment, his spear now hanging forgotten at his side, and then looked toward Farlan with an expression that needed no translation for Elira to understand. He saved me. He had every chance to let that boar reach me, or to simply run while we were distracted, and instead he chose to fight for a man who came here to kill him. Farlan lowered his own spear slowly, his eyes moving from the wolf's injured shoulder to Elira's face, still set with quiet, unwavering determination, and finally, for the first time since the chase had begun, something in his expression softened into genuine uncertainty. He looked, Elira thought, like a man who had built an entire understanding of the world around a story that had just been proven, in the space of a few violent seconds, to be far more complicated than he had ever allowed himself to consider. "Stand down," Farlan said finally, his voice carrying enough weight and reluctant authority that the remaining hunters along the ridge above, who had been working their way down to join the confrontation, paused where they stood. He turned back to Elira, his hands moving slowly and imperfectly into the signs he had clearly not used in a very long time, shaped with the rough uncertainty of someone dredging up a nearly forgotten memory. "Are you safe? Has he truly never hurt you?" Elira nodded firmly, her own hands moving in response with the fluid ease of long practice, telling him everything she had wanted the entire village to understand for weeks now, that this creature they had all feared was gentle and careful, and had spent months proving, in 100 small quiet ways, that the stories told around the well bore almost no resemblance to the truth of who he actually was. She gestured toward his injured shoulder, toward the way he had thrown himself into danger to protect a stranger, a man who had come to the forest that very morning, intending to end his life. Farlan looked at the wolf for a long, considering moment, and then did something none of his men expected, and something Elira herself would remember for the rest of her life, as the precise moment everything began, finally, to change. He knelt down slowly, lowering his spear fully to the ground beside him, and extended one open, empty hand toward the creature that stood, wary but unmoving, only a short distance away. The wolf did not move at first. every instinct built from a lifetime of arrows and traps holding him still, and wary, at the sight of an open human hand extended so close. Alira reached out and rested her own palm gently against his uninjured shoulder, a small, familiar reassurance, and slowly, cautiously, he lowered his head enough to allow the barest brush of contact between his fur and Farland's outstretched fingers. It was not trust, not yet, not fully. But it was a beginning, the same kind of beginning Alira herself had once offered him in a quiet clearing weeks before, and something about witnessing it seemed to loosen a knot that had sat tight in Farland's chest for as long as he had led hunts into this forest. He rose slowly, calling up to the men still waiting along the ridge, his voice carrying clearly enough now that even Alira could read the shape of his words from the sudden, visible relief that spread across the faces above them. The hunt was over. Nobody would be raising a spear against this creature today. The walk back to Ashwell felt entirely different from the frantic chase that had carried them into the forest that morning. Alira walked beside the wolf, one hand resting against his side, while Farland and his men followed a respectful distance behind, their earlier grim determination replaced now by a kind of subdued wonder none of them quite knew how to put into words. Bexley, still shaken from his near encounter with the boar, kept glancing toward the wolf, with an expression somewhere between gratitude and disbelief, as though still working out how a story he had believed his entire life could have been so thoroughly incomplete. Word reached the village long before they did. A boy sent running ahead, by one of the hunters, arrived breathless at the square, and by the time Alira's small procession crossed the last field before the stone markers of the village itself, a crowd had already begun to gather, drawn by rumors of what had happened in the forest that morning, uncertain whether they were about to witness a victory or a tragedy. The sight that greeted them silenced the crowd more completely than any single explanation could have. A deaf girl the village had so often overlooked walked calmly beside the very creature they had spent years fearing, her hand resting against his shoulder with a familiarity that spoke of far more history than anyone had realized existed. Behind her walked the hunting party that had left that morning armed and grim, now returning with their spears lowered and their faces carrying an expression closer to humility than triumph. Nora pushed through the gathered crowd the moment she caught sight of her daughter, relief and fear warring across her face in equal measure, and Doran was close behind her, his eyes moving rapidly between his daughter and the massive wolf walking so calmly beside her. Clearly struggling to reconcile the monster he had feared, with the creature now standing quietly at the edge of the village, watching the crowd with the same wary caution he had always shown, waiting to see whether this new, larger audience would greet him with violence, or something else entirely. Alira signed quickly to her parents, explaining as much as she could in the space of a few urgent gestures, that he had saved a man's life that very morning, that he had never once threatened her in all the months she had visited him, that everything the village believed about him had grown from fear rather than truth. She watched her mother's hands press against her own mouth, watched her father's shoulders slowly lower from their rigid, protective stance, watched the crowd itself begin to shift, murmurs of disbelief slowly softening into something closer to careful curiosity. Farland stepped forward then, addressing the gathered villagers directly, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man admitting he had been wrong in front of the very people who had trusted his judgment enough to follow him into danger. He told them what he had witnessed in the ravine, the boar's charge, the wolf's choice to fight rather than flee, the strange, unmistakable loyalty of a creature who had every reason to abandon them all and chose instead to protect a stranger who had come to end his life. It did not change the mind of every person gathered in that square that afternoon. Old fears rarely dissolve completely in a single afternoon, and Alira could see, even among the softening crowd, faces that remained tight with lingering suspicion, unwilling to fully release a story they had carried and repeated for years. But something had shifted, undeniably and permanently, in the space between the village and the forest that had always felt like enemy territory, and Alira understood, standing there, with her hands still resting against the wolf's fur, that this shift, however incomplete, was more than she had ever dared to hope for when she first crossed the stone markers all those weeks ago. The weeks that followed brought changes to Ashwell that nobody could have predicted on the morning Farland and his men had marched into the forest with spears raised. The wolf did not move into the village, nor did he abandon the wild, quiet life he had always known among the ancient trees, but the sharp line that had once separated the forest from the fields softened into something more like a boundary crossed carefully, on occasion, by both sides. Elira no longer needed to sneak past a locked gate to visit him. Her father, still uneasy but no longer gripped by the same raw fear that had driven him to bar the back gate, walked with her to the stone markers himself on several occasions, watching from a respectful distance as his daughter sat beside the creature he had once been certain would harm her. Doran never fully lost his caution, but Elira watched it soften, slowly, into something closer to grudging respect, especially after the day he witnessed for himself, the gentle way the wolf lowered his great head to rest against her shoulder. Nora, in her own way, found comfort in a different kind of change. She began noticing how much lighter her daughter seemed in the evenings now, how the quiet loneliness that had followed Elira through so many years, in a village not built for her silence, had eased into something closer to genuine contentment. She still worried, as mothers do, but she stopped trying to talk her daughter out of a friendship that had so clearly given Elira something the rest of Ashwell had never quite managed to offer her. Farlan visited the forest twice more in the months that followed, not with a spear this time, but with a quiet curiosity that surprised even himself. He never grew as close to the wolf as Elira had, the trust between them remaining cautious and distant, but he became, in his own gruff way, one of the wolf's most vocal defenders whenever old rumors resurfaced in the village square, silencing exaggerated stories with a first-hand account that carried far more weight than any second-hand tale ever could. Bexley, still shaken by how close he had come to serious harm that morning in the ravine, took to leaving small offerings of dried meat near the stone markers whenever he passed that way, a quiet, private gratitude he rarely spoke of, but never quite stopped practicing. It became, over time, a small tradition among a handful of villagers, a quiet acknowledgement that the forest held more than danger within its shadows. Not everyone in Ashwell came to see the wolf the way Elira did. Some villagers remained wary for the rest of their lives, choosing to keep their distance regardless of what they had heard about the boar, or the ravine, or the girl who had once stood so calmly between armed men and a creature everyone had sworn was a monster. Fear, Elira had come to understand, did not always yield fully to truth, even when the truth stood plainly in front of people willing to look. But it no longer ruled the village the way it once had, and that, she decided, was enough of a victory to carry with her. The stone markers remained standing at the edge of the forest, worn and weathered as they had always been, but they no longer felt like a wall meant to keep two worlds forever apart. Elira crossed them often now, sometimes with her father walking quietly beside her, sometimes alone in the soft gold light of late afternoon, always greeted by the same pale eyes that had once watched her from the shadows, with a caution built from years of being feared rather than understood. She never forgot the first time she had reached out and rested her hand against his face, shaping words he could not hear, but somehow still received. "You look lonely." It had been true of him then, in a forest that had taught him only to expect pain from the world beyond his trees, and it had been true of her as well, in a village that had never quite learned how to reach her across the silence she carried. What grew between them in the months and years that followed was not built on words at all, not on the sounds that had always separated Elira from the rest of Ashwell, but on something steadier and far more enduring, a language built entirely from patience, from stillness, from the simple, radical choice to see one another clearly, when the rest of the world had chosen only to imagine. And in the quiet clearing where it had all begun, beneath the ancient trees that had once sheltered a legend built from fear, a girl who could not hear, and a wolf who had never truly been the monster of the story, sat together in comfortable, unbroken silence, finally, fully, no longer alone.